Anyway, so I think I'll step back from the kind of detailed studies we have heard in the last three lectures, one dealing with the question of international cooperation and its many dimensions, particularly its example of South-South cooperation that we heard from in the Sino-Brazil context, and the other is a sort of sectoral assessment of the issues around adaptation in the case of water, and of course, finally the question of vulnerability assessment, which is surely a very important part of the story with regard to dealing with climate change. But what I would like to talk about very briefly here, indicate, is that we still lack an adequate framework in which to think about climate change and what we need to do about it. The we I use here in two senses of the term. I believe my primary use of the word we is in the context of India. And there is really an immediate need for India post-Durban to... can we have that volume down? Immediate need for India for post-Durban to acquire some real clarity in what its climate policy is. And I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we underestimate the extent of strategic confusion that exists. I don't use the term strategic here in any security connotation. It is used in a much broader sense in terms of a long-term view of the situation. Extending, typically the time horizon in these things is up to 2050, and this is not too far away. So, this is in fact the framework, the time horizon in which international global negotiations are taking place. So it's not a irrelevant time scale to pick. The other use of the term we, of course, has to do with the larger context of developing countries in particular. But I will begin from India for two reasons. One, my experience with India, and I think the case of India looms large in the larger question of the issues in climate and the need for a strategic perspective. So there are some particular features of global warming of anthropogenic origin. To give the beast its actual name, it is not really some neutral climate change. There is a cause and its effect is known. So what do we need to do about it? There are two aspects to it. They are fairly straightforward. One is we need to cut down anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. It's not just methane, it's not just black carbon, it's all the new entrants that come and go. But the bulk of it is really carbon dioxide. There is simply no getting around that fact. So cutting down anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide is the crux of the matter. That's on the one side. Second is that nobody fools oneself that, dealing with the consequences of the emissions of the past and the future will need, you'll have to deal with it. There will be consequences. Whether these consequences are manifest in the form in which your society is today, which is might be called contextual vulnerability, or in a related fashion perhaps it also the outcomes that are a consequence of these past emissions. Whichever way you look at it, we can debate it separately, but I think dealing with the consequences of emissions of the past and the future, because we are obviously not going to switch off emissions within the next few years immediately, and they will have consequences. That is adaptation. So we have to do both. Now, obviously, if it were purely technical or scientific, things perhaps would have been easier. But the crux of the problem is its intricate connection with the social, the economic, and the political. So that's obvious. Why is it so difficult to deal with global warming? See, first is, of course, it is a subject given to considerable uncertainty. And that, of course, So, for instance, how much is climate change impacting agriculture today? I think, that you really have to look at the data carefully, and, there are, a variety of results on the subject, and it's not easy to make out, what are the, what are the consequences. We know for sure that anthropogenic origin is the cause of the global warming we see, but its precise form, and all the drivers associated with it, all its manifestation, and especially going down to regional level predictions as opposed to broad global predictions, is very complex. So so it's all very well to tell a policy maker that global warming is very serious, it will affect weather patterns. So obviously he sits back, he listens to you and says, what about the monsoon? And then you give a sort of embarrassed smile, because the monsoon still lacks a considerable degree of accuracy in the kind of predictions we can make about it. So there are these difficulties in getting the point across. And this is not, of course, I'm not making a case for climate skepticism, mind you. The second and very even more important difficulty is the difficulty in understanding and dealing with climate risk. So we are simply not used to the temporal horizon of 2050 in terms of policy making. A business is perhaps the most problematic. Their time horizon consists of the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter. So, it is not even clear how they can comprehend the issue of sustainability, unless you have time horizons that stretch considerably longer. And also, of course, for political leadership, a time horizon of, 5 years till the next election. For economists, 10 years, perhaps they would be doing very well. So it's really comprehending the temporal horizons in climate change is complex. And of course, it's not just simply that's a problem of political leader. Low probability, high impact events, how do we deal with them? These are things on which academics differ fairly violently. So, there is a real issue here and it's not easily solved. And of course, the real crux of the problem is the continued and extraordinary dependence on fossil fuels of the bulk of the production and consumption systems in the world. So, but surely we need to do something about it. Not doing anything about it is not an option. Mind you, there is no universal consensus on this. And it comes garbed in, many sort of seductive academic forms, if you wish. For instance, if I may mention this case, so for instance, you take this eminent economist Nordhaus for, his models of global warming, and he is really one of the fathers of the subject of integrated assessment modeling. He really says, you can, very little you can do about it, and the best thing you can do is, have some technology in the future which will settle the question. So basically his recipe is not to do very much about it, and put all your money into technological sort of investigation and new technologies, and it will come out, or equivalently you might say, hope for the best. So that I think, however, over time has lost traction, but so clearly in the arena of what we need to do about climate change, quite apart from adaptation, there are two basic approaches. One, in terms of mitigation, and one we may call burden sharing, and the other would be resource sharing. Now, burden sharing is, is the favorite, trend when it comes from, the academic world of the developed countries, and it rests fundamentally on, a counterfactual. How much should one reduce from what one would have been emitting normally? Or in business as usual. And that is very problematic. It depends on what you think is business as usual. And in the case of India, you can see widely divergent figures. It's true for the rest of the world. The other is that of resource sharing, more, tied into the idea of a global commons. And I am happy that, Colonel Gautam, made explicit reference to this in the morning. And what has given scientific sort of backing to the idea of using the commons as a way to think about it is the idea of carbon budgets. So there was somebody in the morning, I think, who mentioned nature science as the sort of defining sort of stuff from is to take data. Yes. Robert was mentioning it was the importance of nature science. So there's a series of papers in Nature that really point to the importance of thinking in terms of a carbon budget. So the entire world has a carbon budget of from 1850 to 2050 if maximum temperature increase has to stay below 2 degrees centigrade. So, then, the question is, how do you share these commons? In some sense, it is there in the spirit of the UNFCCC, if pollution, if greenhouse gas emissions is pollution, you ought to do something about it. And it would be pollution only if you were, polluting a commons. There is an idea of the commons implicit anyway. So this idea of fair and equitable access to this global commons is something of a consensus view in India, and certainly in the case of India and China. It is not true that it is shared widely among third world countries. It's a very common sort of misconception in India, somehow that, South Africa and Brazil share our position on the nature of the atmosphere as a commons. There are considerable differences of detail. But the question is, if you have a commons, and there is equity is the question of a fair access to these commons, and this is the basis on which you should solve the climate issue. What does a fair share mean? And that's fairly easily definable. You can do per capita, you can do variations, all that is possible. Other thing is, however, which is far more the serious question, is this fair share accessible? Can you get hold of it? Is it available to you? And here I think there is a real fundamental problem in Indian climate policy making. See, it is true that the industrialized countries as a whole have occupied much more than their fair share of the global commons. But these emissions cannot be simply scrubbed out of the atmosphere. So it is a fact that whatever is the consequence, we can in physical terms, I'm not talking in terms of, fiscal transfers, technology transfers or whatever, but in purely physical terms, there is only so much that can be accessed. And this is something that Indian climate policy making refuses to face up to. Now, the problem with this is the following. Why should we adhere to that? Why should we say that there is only a limited space which is available? We have to stay within that. Because equally, if the temperature crosses 2 degrees centigrade, overall, India will equally suffer. India's adaptation requirements will zoom. It will have severe impacts. And we are not, adaptation is an issue for all countries. And if you are thinking that your adaptation burden will be on par with the rest of the world, with the developed world, that gives you a development window of, 30 years, and that's really asking for too much. So, your adaptation requirements will be really high if you start crossing 2 degrees centigrade. So the nub of the question is this. We have to access, in some sense, to the maximal possible extent, a reasonable proportion of our fair access to carbon space. And this we require for, mitigation, for development, etc. But at the same time, we cannot debate endlessly over it, because an early climate agreement is as much a necessity. And the other point which is often forgotten in this sort of the general working up in the media that we get, just before every COP in this country, is this idea somehow, if we don't get a fair agreement, let us reject it. But that's really not an option we have, because if you take that position, then you are saying, I'm willing to take the risks that go with it. And I don't think, if you're thinking in terms of the needs of the majority of a population, that's a very wise decision. So, we need an equitable agreement. We need this agreement, however, early. So, while we argue for equity and would try to maximize it, we also need to facilitate an early climate agreement. And this is, I think, the crux of the message I want to deliver. I think what is the problem? Typically, both theoretically in a larger context and in the articulation of Indian policy, there has been a real profound confusion between international equity and what one may call global equity. International equity is a question of equity between nations. As nation states, what is it? Is your relative share? Do you get a fair deal as a nation, etc.? It may be complex. Island states, for instance, have a very particular issue. But all put together, this is international equity. Global equity, however, refers to your rights as, as a citizen of Earth, as a human being, and this is sort of coextensive, I believe, with domestic equity. When we talk of equity in human terms, when we talk of, material well-being of the population, etc., we are also talking of the equity of people as individuals, as human beings, and this is the same as, global equity. And this is a very useful and important distinction, and I think which is there in the work of Amartya Sen in that famous volume on global public goods. So somehow in the making of Indian policy, we have always been focused on international equity, ignoring the fact that to make the case validly to all nations, we also need to preserve a balance with global equity. So, between climate policy and foreign policy today, we have something of a conflict of paradigms. There is obviously a third worldist rhetoric that conflicts with a new strategic view of the world. So, both are equally problematic, in my opinion, for solving the climate issue. The third worldist rhetoric, we saw a good dose of it, post-Durban. Very odd, considering the rest of our rhetoric on everything else for the last 15 years. So, in the third worldist view, it really underestimates the extent to which all countries have to do something for controlling global warming. It also tends to underestimate, and this is very important and was referred to somewhat elliptically in the paper of our Chinese colleague. There are important differences, within the G77 and within basic countries, which perhaps we need to talk about. And the undifferentiated third worldist position, ironically, was part of what divided IOSIS and the Africa group from India and China at Durban. On the other hand, the new strategic view limits our ability to deal with inequitable schemes of global mitigation that are constantly appearing on the agenda. If, for instance, there was a real miscalculation, I believe, at Durban, sections of our policymakers in climate, I am personally aware, are fully of the opinion that a climate agreement will never be reached. And in fact, as a consequence, when they went to Durban, they were blindsided by the possibility that an important step in developing such an agreement could actually emerge. So, one has to be, I think, careful. There are other theoretical, conceptual confusions about top-down and bottom-up, etc. So that's not, I'm not going into the details of that. But, we really need, therefore, something of putting together is not the details, I think, which are at issue here, but to accept and figure out the balance, and then we will get to the technical details of the balance of responsibility we have in assuring an equitable space for our development in the future, while at the same time sort of figuring out what are our responsibilities in terms of global mitigation, both based on the needs of the world as a whole and the needs of the majority of our population. So I believe, what is, do I have a conceptual framework for it? Not really. Some model of cooperative conflict, even though it appears like a contradiction in terms, is something which is on the agenda. I don't have one to offer to you right away, but I would submit that a lot of other paradigms which make the rounds, thinking purely in terms of resource-based conflicts, various models of, national, nations as actors with rational self-interest, bottom-up approaches, Ostrom's polycentrism, all have, I think, missed one or the other of important elements of what the issue is for countries like India, and I submit also on a larger scale the bulk of G77 countries. Thank you.